There is a kind of transformation that happens in silence. It doesn't make noise, it does not ask for recognition, and it is almost never noticed by those who observe from the outside. On the outside, life continues to look the same. The same days pass, the same streets are traveled, the same people are still around, but something profoundly different begins to be born within the soul. Carl Jung said that true psychological transformation does not happen when someone learns something new about the world. It happens when the person finally crosses something within himself. And there is a rare moment in the journey of some empaths when this happens irreversibly. It is not a moment of visible victory. It is not an instant that the world celebrates. It's a quiet moment, but definitive, because at that moment, the empath stops trying to survive the world, and he begins, for the first time, to truly exist within himself. For a long time, the empath lived trying to understand everything around him, feeling too much, noticing too much, carrying emotions that many times were not even his. He was trying to adjust. He tried to explain himself. He was trying to find a place where he could finally rest. But what few understand, this deep sensitivity has never been a mistake. It has always been the beginning of a path that almost no one travels to the end. Carl Jung called one of the rarest stages of this journey something that, to many, still sounds mysterious. Sophia, not as an intellectual concept, not as a philosophical idea, but as a state of consciousness, a point in the inner journey where something within the soul finally organizes, where the person stops fighting against himself, where the fragmented parts of the psyche begin to recognize each other. And when that happens, something old dies. The identity that has spent years trying to please, explain, adapt and survive slowly begins to fade. Not with violence, not with revolt, but with a strange sense of clarity. The empath begins to realize that much of the pain he carried during his life was not a sign of weakness. It was a calling, a silent call to cross something that few people are willing to face: the encounter with oneself. And when this crossing actually happens, when the empath finally reaches that point of inner maturity, he is no longer the person the world thought he could define. He is no longer someone who can be easily manipulated, interpreted or controlled. Because something essential changes. It is not arrogance, it's not coldness, it is freedom. A freedom that is born when the person finally stops seeking permission to exist. It is at this point in the journey that many empaths discover something surprising. What seemed to be his greatest weakness throughout his life. In fact, it was the beginning of his greatest strength. Sensitivity that once seemed like a burden is transformed into consciousness. The silence that once seemed like isolation is transformed into inner sovereignty. And the loneliness that once seemed like abandonment begins to reveal something very different, an internal space where the soul finally breathes. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation is the most difficult path that a human being can take, because it requires the person to abandon the masks they used to survive. It requires her to see her own shadow. It requires her to go through the discomfort of no longer fitting into the expectations of the world. But it is also the path that leads to the deepest form of psychological freedom that exists. And when an empath comes to Sophia, something extraordinary happens. He stops trying to be understood by everyone. He stops trying to prove his worth. He stops seeking approval, not because he has closed himself off from the world, but because he finally found something much more solid within himself, an identity that no longer depends on external validation, a presence that can no longer be shaped by fear, a consciousness that has already gone through its own darkness and discovered something unexpected there. Light. Not the idealized light that many people imagine, but the quiet light of those who finally know who they are. And when someone reaches that point, the world may even keep trying to define that person. But something inside it no longer belongs to the old rules, because the empath that reaches Sophia stops reacting to the world. He starts to live from a center that no one can control. And it is exactly in this silent moment of the journey that true transformation begins. The moment the empath realizes it's always been different. There is a quiet moment in the life of an empath that almost no one around notices. It is not a dramatic event. It's not a sudden revelation that changes everything at once. In fact, on the outside, almost nothing seems to happen. Life goes on. People keep talking about the same things. The days continue to pass at the same pace, but within the tie, something begins to reorganize. For a long time, he believed that the way he felt the world was just a personal difficulty, an oversensitivity, a complicated way of existing. He wondered why certain situations affected him so deeply, because certain environments tired him, why certain people seemed to suck their energy, because certain feelings lingered inside him much longer than inside anyone else. For years he tried to adapt. He tried to become tougher, more indifferent, more like those who seem to go through life without carrying so many emotional layers, but something inside him always resisted. No matter how hard he tried to adjust, sensitivity returned, not as weakness, but as a constant presence. Over time, this perception begins to mature. The empath begins to realize that his way of feeling the world is not a mistake. It is a profound feature of your own psychic structure. Carl Jung believed that some people are born with a greater openness to the contents of the unconscious. They capture more, they understand more, they feel more. And this openness can be difficult to carry when one does not yet understand what it means. Because for a large part of life, the empath tries to live as if he were the same as the others. He tries to ignore what he feels, try to reduce the impact of experiences. But there comes a time when something changes. A silent perception begins to be born. Maybe it's not broken. Maybe he's just having a different experience. This understanding does not come as an explosion. Ela is born slowly, like a clarity that is gradually formed within the mind. The empath begins to look at his own history in a different way. The isolation phases are starting to make sense. The moments of introspection begin to reveal something important. Even the emotional pain he's carried for so long begins to feel like part of something bigger. And it is at this point that something very important happens. He stops fighting himself. This change is silent, but profound, because for a long time, much of the empath's suffering did not come only from the world around him. It came from the internal conflict of trying to be someone he could never be. When this struggle ends, something begins to reorganize itself within the psyche. The energy that was once used to adapt begins to be directed to something much more important, self-knowledge. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the way in which a person stops living only according to external expectations and begins to discover who he really is. And for the empath, this path often begins exactly at this simple moment, the moment he finally accepts that his difference is not a defect. It is the beginning of a journey that few understand, and that even fewer people are willing to cross to the end. Because accepting who you really are, it is always the first step of a transformation that can no longer be undone, the silent pain that starts the true inner journey. Before any great inner transformation, there is almost always a period of deep emotional confusion, a period in which the person feels that something inside them is changing, but he still can't explain exactly what's going on. For many empaths, this period can last for years, sometimes even decades. It is a time marked by a strange sense of not belonging, not because the empath rejects the world, but because he often feels that the world around him seems too superficial for what he feels inside. Conversations that feel natural to other people can feel empty. Environments that seem normal to most can feel emotionally heavy. Social situations that should be mild can generate a feeling of deep exhaustion. And for a long time, the empath tries to find a simple explanation for all this. Maybe he thinks he needs to change. You may think you need to become stronger. Perhaps he tries to ignore this sensitivity altogether. But the truth is that this attempt to deny one's own nature almost always generates more pain. Because when a person tries to reject what they are, it creates a division within itself. A part of the psyche tries to adapt, while another part continues to insist on existing. Carl Jung observed that psychological pain often arises at exactly this point, when important parts of the soul are ignored or repressed. In the case of the empath, this repression can happen in a very subtle way. He learns to hide what he feels. He learns not to talk about his perception of things. He learns to act as if nothing is happening inside him. But the unconscious never disappears. That which is not recognized is still alive within the psyche. And over time, this tension begins to manifest itself in different ways. Feelings of emotional exhaustion, moments of deep introspection, periods in which the empath feels an almost inexplicable need to get away from the world. These moments are not signs of weakness. In fact, they are often signs that something very profound is happening. The psyche slowly begins to reorganize its structures. The person begins to realize that he can no longer continue to live only according to external expectations. This process can be uncomfortable because it forces the empath to look within. And looking inward isn't always easy. There are memories, there are old emotions, there are parts of the story itself that have not yet been fully understood, but it is exactly in this process of inner diving that something important begins to be born. Consciousness. The empath begins to realize that much of the pain he carried throughout his life was not simply a personal problem. It was a calling, a call to an inner journey that few people actually go through, the journey of becoming who you are. Carl Jung said that no one becomes conscious without first crossing one's own darkness. And for the empath, this crossing often happens in silence. No witnesses, no applause, only with the constant presence of something inside him that insists on evolving. And when this process really begins, the person realizes that he can no longer go back to the old way of living, because something inside her has already awakened, something that no longer accepts living on the surface, something that wants to understand one's own soul. And it is exactly this silent search that begins the true path of transformation, the path that, one day, can lead you to a much deeper state of consciousness, a state that Jung associated with the flourishing of one's own essence, a state that, for many, receives an old name, Sophia, the encounter with one's own shadow that almost no one is ready to face. There is a point in the empath's inner journey when the search for understanding ceases to be just a silent curiosity, and it becomes an inevitable crossing. Up until that point, much of the journey was about perceiving the world in a deeper way. Perceive emotions, perceive environments, perceive intentions, but there comes a moment when attention is no longer turned outwards, and he begins to turn completely inward. It is at this moment that the empath finds something that Carl Jung considered essential for any true psychological transformation: the shadow. The shadow is not something evil. It is not an enemy hidden within the psyche. It is simply everything that has been forgotten, ignored, or repressed throughout life. Parts of the personality that have not had space to exist, feelings that have been silenced, desires that were deemed inappropriate, internal forces that have never been fully recognized. For many empaths, this encounter can be especially intense. because for much of their lives they have learned to be understanding, they learned to feel for others, they learned to put other people's well-being before their own. This posture can create a very specific identity, an identity that is built around sensitivity, empathy, and understanding. But within every human being there are many other layers. There are denser emotions, there are impulses that are not so smooth, there are internal forces that do not fit the image of someone who is always understanding. And when the empath begins to look inward with honesty, these parts begin to appear, not as something to be feared, but as something that needs to be recognized. Carl Jung said that what we deny in ourselves never disappears. On the contrary, he continues to live in the unconscious, waiting for the moment when he can finally be seen. And when that moment comes, the person may feel a mixture of surprise and release, because she realizes that she is not just what she believed herself to be. There is much more within it. There is strength, there is firmness, there is an ability to set internal boundaries that previously seemed non-existent. This discovery can be uncomfortable at first. The empath may realize that part of his old identity was built from external expectations. He believed that he needed to always be kind, always available, always understanding. But true psychological maturity requires something different. It requires integration. It means allowing all parts of the psyche to have space within consciousness. The sensitivity continues to exist, but now she is no longer alone. It is accompanied by a new inner presence, a more solid presence, more aware, more balanced. When this integration begins to happen, the empath realizes something very important. He no longer has to choose between being sensitive or being strong. It can be both. This union between sensitivity and strength creates something rare, a consciousness that no longer needs to protect itself through denial, an identity that begins to become whole. And when that inner wholeness begins to emerge, the old way of living is slowly beginning to lose its meaning, because the empath is no longer divided within itself. He begins to walk in the world with a different presence, quieter, more aware, more real. And this is exactly the point in the journey where transformation begins to become irreversible. When the old identity begins to fade quietly, after the shadow begins to be recognized and integrated, something curious happens in the inner life of the empath. The old identity slowly begins to dissolve, not dramatically, not as a sudden break, but like an old garment that, little by little, no longer fits. For many years the empath built an image of himself, a way of existing in the world that seemed necessary to survive emotionally. He learned to please, he learned to adapt, he learned to avoid internal and external conflicts. This identity served as a kind of protection. She helped the empath navigate the emotional complexities of life. But every identity built just to survive has a limit. At some point, it starts to become too small for what the person is becoming. And this is exactly what happens when the process of individuation begins to mature. The empath begins to realize that certain attitudes no longer make sense. Certain conversations seem empty. Certain environments cease to generate interest. Not because the empath has become distant or superior, but because something inside him has changed. Consciousness began to expand. And when consciousness expands, the old psychological structure can no longer sustain the same way of living. This can generate a period of great inner silence, a period in which the empath naturally moves away from many things that were once part of his life, not as rejection, but as a natural movement of reorganization. Carl Jung described this moment as a kind of symbolic death, not in the literal sense, but in the psychological sense. The old version of the person needs to disappear so that a new identity can be born. This process may seem strange to outsiders. Because many changes happen internally, the empath may seem quieter, more reflective, more selective with your energy. But inside, something very profound is happening. The old structures of the personality are being reorganized. What was once guided by fear begins to be replaced by something much more stable. Consciousness. The empath begins to act less by reaction and more by presence. He no longer feels the need to explain who he is. He no longer feels the need to prove his worth. He no longer feels the urgency to be understood by everyone. This change creates a new way of existing in the world, a much quieter way, but also much more authentic. The person starts to move through life with a different sense of identity, not based on the role it plays for others, but based on something internal, something that no longer depends on external approval. And when this new identity begins to consolidate, the empath notices something surprising. The old life no longer calls him the same way. What once seemed essential now seems distant. Not because it was rejected, but because it is simply no longer necessary. This phase can be lonely, but it is also profoundly liberating, because it is in this silence that the new identity begins to be born, an identity that was not created to survive, but to exist in a true way. And this inner truth prepares the empath for something even rarer, a state of consciousness that Jung described as one of the deepest points of the human journey. A state where the soul finally finds its own center. The birth of the consciousness that no longer needs the world's approval. There is a moment in the empath's journey when something inside him finally stabilizes. For a long time, his inner life was marked by questions. Questions about who he was, questions about your place in the world, questions about why she felt everything so intensely. These questions have accompanied his journey for years. They were present in the moments of silence, in periods of introspection, on the days when he felt that something inside him was changing. But I still didn't know exactly what. But when the old identity begins to fade and the shadow is no longer denied, something new begins to be born. A different form of consciousness. It's not a feeling of superiority. It's not a need to prove something. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's a deep tranquility. The empath begins to realize that he no longer needs the constant validation of the world to know who he is. For much of his life, he looked for external signs. He sought approval. He sought understanding. He sought recognition, not because he was weak, but because, like any developing human being, he needed references to understand himself. But now, something has changed. The reference began to emerge from within. Carl Jung said that psychological maturity happens when the center of the personality is no longer in external expectations and starts to exist within the consciousness itself. This inner center is something rare because it does not depend on circumstances. He does not depend on people's approval. He does not depend on praise. It does not depend on being understood. It simply exists. When the empath finds this center within himself, the relationship with the world changes profoundly. He remains sensitive. He continues to perceive the emotions around him. He continues to have empathy. But now that sensibility no longer dominates him. She doesn't drag him. It doesn't disorganize you. It only exists as a natural capacity for perception. The difference is that now there is something even stronger behind this sensitivity. Presence. The empath begins to walk through life with a different calm. He no longer reacts to everything. You no longer feel obligated to respond to every emotional stimulus around you. He observes, you see, he understands, but it maintains its own internal stability. This stability is born when the person finally accepts who they are, not as an idealized idea, but as a living reality. The empath stops trying to fit into all expectations. He stops trying to live up to all projections. And interestingly, it is exactly at this moment that something very rare happens. Inner freedom begins to emerge. because most of the psychological prisons that people carry throughout their lives are not external. They are internal. They are built by the constant need for approval, because of the need to be accepted, because of the need to be validated. When that need disappears, the person begins to experience something profoundly transformative. Authenticity. She begins to live according to her own inner truth. And this truth does not need to be announced. It doesn't need to be explained. It simply manifests itself in the way a person exists in the world. This is one of the quietest phases of the empath's journey, but also one of the most powerful, because it is at this moment that he stops living as someone who is constantly looking for something outside himself, and he begins to live as someone who has found something essential within himself. And this discovery paves the way for the rarest stage of this entire inner crossing, a stage that Jung associated with the flowering of the deep wisdom of the soul, a state that some ancient traditions have called Sophia. Sophia, the point of the journey, where the empath becomes uncontrollable to the world. There is a stage in the inner journey that few people can really understand, not because it is inaccessible, but because it requires a transformation that is too profound for most consciousnesses that are still stuck in the old structures of identity. This stage has been described in different ways throughout history. Some called it an awakening, others called it lighting. Carl Jung, in studying the deepest processes of the human psyche, described something similar within the path of individuation, a point at which consciousness ceases to be fragmented, and it starts to organize itself around a deeper center. This center is something that cannot be manipulated by outside influences. It cannot be shaped by fear. It cannot be controlled by the expectations of the world. This state is symbolically represented by something very old, Sophia. Sophia is not just an idea. It represents a state of maturity of the soul, a state in which the person has already crossed their own shadows, their own illusions, and their own inner pains. When the empath reaches this point in the journey, something inside him changes definitively. He stops reacting to the world. He starts to live from himself. This does not mean isolation. It does not mean rejection of people. It means inner autonomy. The empath comes into existence from a place that can no longer be manipulated, because your conscience no longer depends on external approval. It no longer depends on the narratives imposed by the environment. It no longer depends on the expectations that other people project. This makes it somewhat impossible to control, not because he is opposed to the world, but because the world no longer defines who he is. Your identity is now born from a much deeper place, a place where sensitivity and strength coexist, where compassion is not weakness, where emotional perception is no longer a vulnerability. It becomes wisdom. Carl Jung believed that when a person reaches this level of inner integration, something very rare happens. The personality is no longer guided only by the ego. It begins to be guided by something bigger, something he called self. The self represents the deepest center of the psyche, the point where all parts of the personality find balance. When the empath starts to live from this center, his presence changes. He doesn't need to convince anyone anymore. He no longer needs to explain himself. You no longer need to fight to exist. He simply is. And this way of existing creates something that many people around notice, even if they don't know how to explain it. A silent presence, a stability that does not depend on circumstances, an inner freedom that cannot be taken away. That's why the empath that reaches Sophia becomes something the world can't control. Because control always depends on fear. It depends on approval. It depends on emotional manipulation. But when the person has already crossed these internal structures, they no longer have power. The empath continues to live in the world. He continues to live with people. He continues to feel life deeply. But now he lives from a different place, a place where the soul has finally found its own center, and when someone gets to that point in the journey, the transformation can no longer be undone, because that which has awakened within the consciousness, he never goes back to sleep.